Good morning again. You have to bear with me. I'm a little winded. I've been watching the Olympics, and it's exhausting. I was watching the women's 100-meter dash last night, and the commentator said something to the effect that at one point during the race, the winner was running at 26.3 miles per hour. That's incredible. I get tired thinking about it. Next time when you're driving home, not in the parking lot, but when you get onto the street and you hit 26 miles an hour, look around and see how fast that is. And this morning, the men's 100-meter dash, they hit 27 miles per hour. Humans are amazing, an amazing creation of God. And I really enjoy the Olympics because people come from all over the world, come together to compete. Sportsmanship, and display all of the work that they have done, both physically and mentally, as well as emotionally. They come together and they share in the experience of celebrating the gift of life that God has given. And it's an amazing thing to watch. So I hope you tune in. That's my plug for the Olympics. Now on to the sermon. So we continue with our understanding of shalom and our role in being the restorers of shalom to God's creation. It's a big, big task. And so far we've talked about how God has restored shalom with us. God has reached out in God's love and said, come back, come back. You are mine. I long to be with you. And all we have to do to restore that relationship is reach back and say, here we are, God. And then we looked at restoring shalom with ourselves, because if we can't love ourselves, how in the hell are we going to love anybody else? So we have to look at ourselves and understand that there is something that is deep within us, something that dates all the way back to that first book of Genesis, where we decided that perhaps God couldn't be trusted, that perhaps God is holding back on us, that maybe that fruit that God asked us not to eat might be the key to that peace of our making. And by eating that fruit, and by disobeying, and by telling God that we do not trust you to provide everything that we need, even though you have, we discovered something. That knowledge of good and evil, maybe, but definitely we discovered that we were naked and that we were afraid and that we were ashamed. And that has been our plague ever since. It's been the motivation for all of the evils that we have done to each other, our own sense that we are not enough, in spite of everything that God continues to tell us. So we look at our shame, we look at our fear, and we hold it up for what it is. Guilt run amok. And we talk with each other, and we work through it and understand that we are indeed fearfully and wonderfully made by a God who breathes life with the breath of love. And then we looked at restoring shalom with God's creation, remembering that in that story of creation we are told that when God placed human in the garden, God gave us three things. God gave us the abundance of everything that is in the garden. God gave us prohibition, just do me this small favor, don't eat of this tree. But God also gave us vocation. I have placed you here to be the keeper of my creation. I have placed you here to protect it and to serve it. And we looked at how we have strayed away from our vocation of protecting and serving God's creation. And we know that these are enormous tasks in front of us. But we can do our part. And then we looked at restoring shalom with family, with each other. And by recognizing and remembering that when God created humankind, God created us in God's image. And as long as we can remember that every time we look at another, every time we gaze into the eyes of another human being, we are gazing into the image of God. And if we can remember that and live that and know that how I treat you is how I treat the image of God, then we are well on our way to restoring shalom with each other and creating a space where not only peace exists, but also wellness, wholeness of being. All of those things that these blessings from this book of Deuteronomy tell us God has promised us. And last week we looked at shalom with race, this construct that we have come up with that says you are other, you are different. And how do we deal with that? By once again understanding that every single person we encounter, no matter what they look like, no matter how they talk, no matter how they worship, whatever it is that they do, they too are the image of God. And this week, here we go. Next week's going to be easier, I promise, because I'm getting worn out with these texts, because Lisa Sharon Harper, the author of that book that we've loosely based this whole series on, has dared us to look at restoring shalom with nations. The text I read for you a few minutes ago is from the book of Deuteronomy. It's the fifth book of what is known as the Torah, those first 5 books of the Hebrew Scripture, our Old Testament. And those first 5 books tell an epic story. It's amazing. We've already talked quite a bit about what happens there at the beginning of Genesis, where in love, in an act of love, God breathed a breath of love and invited all of creation into being. In that same breath of love, God invited creation to participate in the creation. But then, as we have already talked about many times, we made that decision that maybe we know more than God. And then shalom began to fall apart. We broke our trusting relationship with God. We broke our trusting relationship with each other. We broke our trusting relationship with God's creation. And within a couple of chapters, brother is killing brother. And just a few chapters later, nations are at war. The very goodness of God's creation, this wholeness of relationship of everything that existed, fell apart in the blink of an eye. But that's not the entirety of this story that we read in this text. Because what we hear in this text is God restoring shalom. God reaching out to God's creation and saying, come back. Please come back. And God does this, not through some magical, mystical thing, but God does this through God's people, through ordinary human beings, not superheroes, ordinary human beings who walked and talked and breathed and messed up just like we do. And yet God used them. When God called Abraham and Sarah, said, come, follow me, and I will make you the parents of generations. And Abraham and Sarah followed. And then they had a son, Isaac, who had sons. One of them was Jacob, who wrestled with God, and God gave him the name Israel. Sound familiar? And Jacob had children, a whole bunch of children, but 12 sons are the focus of the story from there. One of those sons, Joseph, the one who ends up in Egypt through a series of shenanigans, ends up being Pharaoh's right-hand man, standing there, side by side with the leader of empire, a trusted assistant to the Pharaoh. So that when famine falls upon the land, Joseph calls his family, calls Jacob and the brothers to come to Egypt to escape the famine. Pharaoh welcomes them, offers them all that Egypt has to offer. And so by the end of the book of Genesis, we see that everybody, that the people of God are fat, dumb, and happy. They're hanging out in Egypt. They've got livestock, they've got food, they've got land, they've got all that they need. But the next book, Exodus, picks up 300 years later. And in 300 years, things have gone pretty far south. In 300 years, new pharaohs came and went, but the Pharaoh that picks up at the beginning of the story no longer cares for those people of Israel, because they have grown so much in numbers that they seem to be a threat to empire. So God reaches out. Once again, calling God's people, sends this man named Moses to go to Egypt, to take God's people out of that place, because Pharaoh had decided that they were no longer human beings, that they were no longer image of God. They were property. They were enslaved to do the work of empire. They belonged to Egypt. And God's response? No. These people do not belong to Egypt. These people belong to me. So Moses leads them out of that place and through the desert to the lands that God had promised their ancestors. And in the 40 years that it took them to get there, God taught them. God taught them through Moses, and God taught them through Aaron, and God taught them through Miriam how to be God's people. How to be God's people. So that's the story that we hear from Exodus through Leviticus and Numbers. And then we come to the book of Deuteronomy, from which this text came today. And they're there. They're knocking at the door of the promised land. They're getting ready to enter into the amusement park, the land of milk and honey. And this whole book is kind of like the huddle that we have right before we go into the amusement park with the kids, right? You have to have the huddle. Come on, really. You gather the kids around and say, okay, we're going to go in here and we're going to have a good time, but there are some rules that we have to follow as we go in here. We're going to have to behave, or somebody's going to get hurt, or somebody's going to get lost, and bad things are going to happen. That's what Moses is doing here in this book. Repeating all of the instructions that they had been receiving over the last 40 years. Deuteronomy literally means second law, the second telling of the law, if you will. And our text today comes from the blessings and the curses. And of course, these are the blessings. If only you remember. If only you remember these things that I have taught you as we journey together through this desert. When you come into this land that is flowing with milk and honey, if you remember how I taught you to be with each other, things will be amazing. You will be blessed. Your children will be blessed. Your children's children, your flock, your fields, everything will be blessed. If you can remember these things. But we know the story. This book, in fact, this whole set of 5 books, this Torah, wasn't written down as these things were happening. There wasn't some scribe following along writing, okay, on day 74 we did this and this and this. This book was put together by a people in exile, by a people who were at a turning point. by the descendants of the people that Moses was talking to there in the desert at the door of the promised land. These people were in exile. Because after the people had entered into that promised land, it wasn't very long until they began to forget all that they were taught in that desert. It wasn't very long until things started to go south, where they began to fight with each other, where they couldn't get along, where they forgot how to be with each other as God's people. And so they turned to someone or something for peace. They were looking for the peace of God in human construct. So they went to God. They went to the prophets of God. And they said, we need a king. We need somebody to lord over us, to make sure everybody plays fair. We need a king, someone to lord over us, to make sure we're protected. We need a king, someone to lord over us so that we can live and prosper like all the other nations of the earth. And God said, no, you don't. You have me. I am your Lord. But they said, yes, we need a king. And God said, okay, here you go. Here's Saul. Good luck with that. And if you read that story, it's a really good story about Saul and his meteoric rise and fall in power. Saul was replaced by David, and under David, all the tribes came together as one nation, united together as a nation. And yes, here we are, we've made it. We have a king, we're a nation like all the other nations. Now we'll be safe. Now we'll know peace. Now we'll prosper. Life will be abundant. And that lasted for less than 100 years. Because after David came Solomon. And with all the wisdom of Solomon, by the time he was done, God was done. By the time Solomon died, God said, no, this isn't working. You will be divided. Now there will be a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. And from there it continued to go downhill. King after king after king continued to try to provide the peace of God through force, through building walls, through doing all the things that humans do, but they could not find it until finally those nations that surrounded them conquered them, carted them off to a distant land in Babylon, made them slaves and servants. And there they were. So these writers of these texts, these ones who took all these stories of their history and put them together into the text that we have today, they were standing there at a turning point because they were looking at the opportunity to return, to try it again, to go back and rebuild the destroyed temple. We have another shot at this. So what was it? What happened? How did we get to this place so we don't do that again? So we read in this story from Genesis all the way through 2 Kings and Chronicles, we read the story of how people turned away from God and turned toward human constructs of kingdom and nation and walls and all of these things. And they said, no, we're not going to do that again. Let's write this down so our children and our children's children know the folly of our mistakes so we dare not repeat them. And they did. And it is useful instruction if we hear it, if we remember it. If we place it on our lintels and our doorposts, we'll remember it, and we'll be better. This time we will listen for God. We will follow God. And God will provide us with the peace and the abundance. By the time Jesus Christ came onto the scene several centuries later, right back where we started. This time, instead of placing faith in the construct of nation and kingdom and a king and all those things, now we've placed all of our faith in a temple system, a system of sacrifices, a system of rules and laws that are meant to keep us in line, but instead of paying attention to the needs of human beings, to the needs of the images of God that are before us, we pay attention to the needs of the system at the expense of the people it was designed to serve. So here we are again, ignoring our vocation of tending to, protecting and keeping God's creation. And so what did Christ do? Christ did not lead a revolt. Christ did not overthrow the Roman Empire. Christ did not destroy the temple system. Christ simply said, "You belong to God. Look at what you are doing. Look at what you are doing to God's creation in service to this system. Look at what you are doing. You are not doing things that are life-giving. You are doing things that are death-dealing. And you must change. Just listen. Listen for God and God's call in your life." So here we are today. And I have to preface with saying that I am proud that I was lucky enough to be born in a geographical location that is inside the United States of America. I am grateful for the privilege that comes through the sacrifice and the hard work and all of the things that those have come before us have done. I am deeply grateful. I have served in the United States military. My son continues to serve in the United States Navy. My heart moves when I hear the national anthem and when I see the flag. My heart is moved because I know that at the core of the purpose of this nation is a constitution that I know is God-breathed, because in that Constitution it says that all people are created equal. And we are working toward that ideal. And as long as I have breath, I believe that this country has a chance, has hope to bring peace. It has hope to recognize that everyone within this country, everyone within this world is indeed created in the image of God. But are we bumping dangerously close to serving the system rather than the creation? In her book, Lisa Sharon Harper has a quote, and it's a whole paragraph. I'll spare you the whole paragraph, but I would like to share this one quote with you. If the construction of empire is our goal, we will become enemies of God's purposes on earth. If our goal is to build the strongest nation, then we will become enemies of God's purposes on earth, because that is not who we were created to be. We were created to be servants and keepers of God's creation. We were created to tend and to serve God's creation. We were not created to build empire. We were created to serve and protect God's creation. And when a system, however marvelous it might be, but when a system is stopping the fresh movement of God's love on the earth, then we must stop and reevaluate what it is we are thinking. When we are more upset about someone kneeling during a song than we are about children being locked in cages, we need to stop and reevaluate. What are we thinking? When billionaires are taking joy rides to space while children are digging in garbage in order to find something to eat, we need to stop and reevaluate. What are we thinking? When CEOs of companies are making hundreds of millions of dollars a year in wages while their employees struggle to find the money to pay for medication for their children, we need to stop and reevaluate. What are we thinking? What are we thinking? Is this restoration of shalom? Yes? No? Maybe? These problems are huge. These challenges are huge. And they face not only this nation, but this entire world. We were called for a purpose. We were created for a purpose. We were given vocation to protect and serve God's creation. If that is our goal, this great nation will thrive because it will fall in the blessings of the Lord. Because when we can recognize the other as the image of God, when we can treat the other as the image of God, when we are more concerned about the people within the systems than the system itself, these blessings of God will come to fruition. I don't know what the answers to these problems are, but I do know this. We won't get at them. Not the way we're behaving today. Simple truth. Because we have half a nation saying this is the solution to our problem. And we have a half a nation saying this is the solution to our problem. And neither one of them are talking to the other. And neither one of them are listening to God very much. So what is our role as the people of God, the ones called here to be disciples of Jesus Christ? What is our role? It begins with talking. It begins with understanding that not all of us are equipped, empowered, and called to be frontline advocates for any one of these issues. Not all of us are, but some of us are. Some of us are passionate about finding resolution to some of these problems that are facing us today. And we can listen. We can listen and we can have good dialogue with these people so that we can understand what is going on, so that we can weigh in with what we understand. So rather than sitting on one side or the other and lobbing bombs at each other, we can have conversation. And as individuals amongst this people of God, we can find out, we can learn, we can try to understand what is going on by talking with other people, but not the people who agree with us, but those who see things differently. So we can bridge that gap. We can restore that sense of shalom to our relationships with each other. The potential of the people in this nation and the privilege that we hold, the privilege that was bought and paid for by the blood of so many who sacrificed to protect it, the privilege of being able to participate where all these resources are going, these resources of God's that we are made stewards of, is a privilege that people of the world have never known before. And as people of God, we have to remember those things that were taught so long ago. Those things that teach us how we are to be with each other, and how we are to be caretakers of God's creation. And if that is our guiding principle, then we will reap the blessings that God has promised. And God will be with us in our endeavors. I'd like to read for you again those blessings. And knowing that most of us are not farmers or herdsmen, ranchers, but these blessings hold true for us and our children and our grandchildren and all of those who surround us. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, and the fruit of your livestock, both the increase of your cattle and the issue of your flock. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. And blessed shall you be when you come, and blessed shall you be when you go. Let us pray. Holy and merciful God, we know that your promises and that your blessings are true, for you are true. God, we know that you call us to serve and to protect your creation. And we are grateful that you have placed us in this place amidst all of this wealth and this opportunity and all of the freedoms that it offers for the purpose of restoring shalom to your created order. Guide us with your wisdom and give us your strength. Help us to stand up where we need to stand up. Help us point the path of shalom to all of those who surround us. Be with us and guide us in this day and all of our days to come, we pray. Amen.